2016, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire between us, we earned something like $5.5 billion from the sale of our cocoa. So you look at it, it means effectively that in the value chain, 5.5% of the value chain is what has come to the producers. To me, that's a completely unacceptable and unfair equation. And the only way that equation can be reconfigured is, of course, if we move up the value chain in the production of our cocoa. And there is where companies like Unilever have shown a great deal of flexibility, have shown a great deal of imagination. And he's talking about the figures, the numbers of figures that they're employing. They're employing them all in value-adding activities in Ghana. And that's where we want to send the Ghanaian economy. We want to send the Ghanaian economy into the era of value addition, of the processing of our agricultural produce, the industrial development of our mineral wealth and resources, and generally seeing to it that the value addition that takes place outside our country and outside our continent takes place inside, because that is the only way we can create jobs for our young people and, of course, also enhance the living standards of our.
Mr. Pullman, 2.5 billion people use your liver products. 57% of your business is in developing and emerging markets. Now, when you look at operating in Africa, they say operating in Africa is quite tough. Is that a perception, or do you have different strategies for operating in Africa, or is it really tough to do business in Africa?
Well, first of all, for example, in countries like Ghana, we've been 98 years. So in Africa, in most of the places that we operate, which is nearly everywhere, we've been 100 years or more. And so through thick and thin and good times and bad times, we stay and build an ecosystem around it. Africa has a lot of things going for it that you need to look at. The population growing by 20% in the next 10, 15 years. It's not that happens in many other places in the world. You'll have 1/5 of the world population here. And the urbanization, obviously, is a key driver of that. You get 190 million more people into cities between now and 2025, 2030. So the economic trends are there. Some of the fastest growing countries, including Ghana, which is now growing between 8 and 9%, you'll find in Africa. So for people that take a longer term view, it is certainly an attractive continent. I would also say from the point of view of technology, you find here in this continent the most sophisticated adoption of technology with things like M-Pesa that everybody is familiar with, well ahead of what you find in the US or in Europe, if I may be honest. And you'll see a rapid adoption of smartphones in this continent that offers a lot more possibilities as we move forward. Like anywhere else, there are some challenges that you need to deal with, not different from others. I think we have here in sub-Sahara Africa that we are now, out of the 45 countries or so, we have 15 that haven't really seen their economies develop, where the GDP per capita has not moved. And that's a challenge, so we need to be part of that. And it gets down to the normal things that are being worked to be sure that governance is functioning, infrastructure is there, education, a very important part. And again, Ghana making that now free for everybody is a wonderful example of how you build the longer term pillars in a country. And then structural reforms, to continue to work on the structural reforms. Where we come in as companies that takes it a long-term view is we can help in that process and help de-risk a little bit the political process as well. It's not easy to be a politician nowadays in any country in the world. And if you have the private sector behind some of the moves, we think it's a good thing to pay tax. We don't think it's a bad thing. We think it's a good thing to fight corruption. We don't think it's a bad thing. We think it's a good thing to invest in education and do a lot of that ourselves. We don't think it's a bad thing. So to have the private sector behind these government plans can result in a better and faster acceleration. But overall, Africa is an exciting region for us, and it will always be, in my opinion.
Africa is an exciting region, and you did speak earlier today, Your Excellency, about how Ghana now is at over 7% growth here. And Mr. Pullman is talking about government and private sector assisting each other in terms of your strategy, your policies for stimulating growth in the private sector in Ghana.
I think that what we've decided in Ghana is something quite simple, basic, but its application is always the difficulty. That first of all, government as much as possible will concentrate on the enabling environment. Government is going to focus on managing the fiscal and monetary policies of the state in such a manner that the stability, the macroeconomic stability that is a condition precedent to any serious business is there. Because with it, you're then more likely to get competitive interest rates, you're likely to get a stable currency. That's one. The other side is to provide a state machinery that is capable of supporting private business, having a state public service that is supportive of private enterprise, that is as much as possible corruption-free, having a state system where the rule of law is not a slogan, but is a genuine principle, an active principle of public policy, so that business people, whether they have issues with the state or between themselves, know that there's a system of independent judges who are capable of applying the law impartially. That framework is the framework that we're trying to establish in Ghana. And also, along with it, the point that Mr. Pullman has just made about companies that recognize the need to pay their taxes. A major issue for us, which has led to our dependence on outside sources for outside public sources for sustenance, is that we're not able to mobilize enough domestic revenue. So, because largely we have tax systems that are very narrow in their base, that are also not particularly efficient. So reforming the tax administration, making it more efficient, at the same time trying to broaden significantly the base, the tax base of the country. All these are the activities of the state that are important, that the state is able to manage efficiently. And that's where we're putting our emphasis. Today, the ports in Ghana are being managed electronically. They haven't resolved all the problems that have been associated hitherto with leakages in our ports, but they're beginning to have an impact and reducing the leakages that we have known in the past. So there's a whole gamut of administrative and, if you like, state-related functions and public goods in the language of the literature that want government to concentrate on and put its energy in making it efficient, because it then provides the basis for which the investment that comes from private enterprise can take place. It's extremely important that, because historically, the governments in my country, for instance, for a long time, attempted to do everything. And by so doing, of course, you mean that you didn't do anything particularly well. So we've now seen that there's a limit to what the public sector can do, but it's important that what that limit is efficiently done. Because once that it's efficiently done, the knock-on effects, the consequences of it for stimulating private sector activity are obvious. We can see it in Ghana today, bringing our public finances under control, under discipline. In the course of 1 year, fiscal deficit that we inherited of 9.3% in the year 2016 has now come down to 5.6 in 2017, with the possibility of it going as far down as 4.5 next year. So And that is a result of discipline. That is a result of insisting on discipline, on insisting on value for money in our public transactions. We are now have moved away from an emphasis on sole sourcing as a way of being able to underpin public procurement, and we have now a much more competitive regime. The year 2016, the public procurement process in Ghana produced almost zero savings. In 2017, it's now over 1 billion cedis of savings that have been made as a result. So these are all the areas of emphasis that the public sector in Ghana is now concerned with. I believe that our part of the equation in making sure that our economies grow faster is the efficiency with which we act.
That efficiency is what I want to hear, though, as well from the multinationals, because Mr. Pollman, what is it you would want from the state to make your work or make your business more profitable on the continent?
Well, I don't believe in just saying I want this from them and this from them. I think the world is more complicated than that's where we are. And we've been around long enough, so to deal with some of the challenges that we have, we need to just work together. And that is probably, this partnership is more important than anything else. This longer-term partnership for the common good. If you're in Africa, you need to operate and work in Africa for the Africans. We produce everything in Africa. We buy as much as we can in Africa. We create the jobs in Africa. And I think other companies should do the same thing. We work with governments to see how we can holistically, in our businesses, attack all the issues. And it's not just about making the money or growing our business. It is to be sure that the communities in which we work function. When we are in Ghana, we will reach millions of people and teaching them oral care or sanitation, because you want the people themselves to be a little bit healthier, and then ultimately your business will work. We work with companies to be sure that they are responsible in fighting corruption where we have corruption, or paying tax where they need to pay tax. So we look at this as partnerships, and we have a wonderful framework here. The President happens to be one of the co-chairs on the request of the Secretary General around the Sustainable Development Goals, which are very pertinent goals to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. And this region, this part of the world, is not excluded from that. 70% of the population still lives on less than $2 a day. That's not in anybody's benefit. Any system where too many people don't participate or are still left behind ultimately will not function for anybody. So business also understands that there is no business case in enduring poverty. And increasingly you see these partnerships developing together. We're building right now a big tea plantation with President Kagame in Rwanda. And the sole purpose of that really is to create jobs for 70, 80, 90,000 people to move that forward. In the Tamare district in Ghana, we work with cooperatives on coconut or shea butter or other oils to create employment for 10, 15,000 people. These are long-term investments that we are willing to make to be sure that these economies function not only today or tomorrow, but for the longer term. So it's these type of partnerships that I believe we need to drive much faster and much harder across the continent.
Mr. Pollman,
I think if I may just add, the partnership also has to embrace a certain change of attitude. We know that one of the biggest problems we have confronted, as talk about us, Africans, the continent, is the flight of capital from our part of the world. Thabo Mbeki's commission that looked into illicit flows of capital made an estimation that as much as 50 billion United States dollars annually leave the continent by way of flights of capital from all kinds of practices and illegal operations. We have made a commitment to develop, along with private sector as a key factor in promoting economic growth. It's important that those who are playing this role recognize the need to be fair in the way in which they deal with the their host governments. And that therefore means that a concerted effort has to be made on their side as well as on our side to prevent this illicit flow of capital. You can imagine what a dramatic transformation would be the circumstances of our governments if they had even half of these monies to be able to underpin the activities in social areas and funding education and funding health and providing the structures for technical and vocational training, which is so very important. It's a very important aspect of the strategy that we have to go looking forward, to commit everybody, government side as well as the private sector, to recognize the rules. Let's get away from offshore tax haven type development of Africa, whereby the methods are found of siphoning these monies outside, and recognize, just as Mr. Pullman is saying, paying taxes is a good thing. People pay taxes in Europe, in America, so that the countries can work. We want the same kind of arrangements in our countries, and we have therefore to establish the institutions that allow us to have that objective.
I do want to come back to you as well on how to make it work, illicit flows, financial flows aside. So one of Africa's priorities that you have mentioned is increasing trade and investment cooperation and not being dependent on aid. And you want to build a Ghana, as you mentioned earlier, a Ghana independent of aid. Can African economies, though, succeed in breaking away from that international system, and how?
They can. We apply the same principles as has happened elsewhere. Already, the decision that has been made to create a continental free trade area, the same decision has been made by ECOWAS to establish a regional market, a community. We're 350 million people now. Efforts are being made to break down trade barriers, to break down customs barriers, so that we have a customs-free arrangement in which we're 350 million people, projected to get to 500 million people by 2030. If indeed that customs union comes into being, that free zone market comes into being, it provides a tremendous opportunity for enterprises, for businesses to be able to grow their businesses to satisfy this market. And of course, there are other measures that have to be taken. We have to deal with the issue of the currency. But those are matters that we are actively confronting and addressing as we speak. So yes, I'm very optimistic that with purposeful leadership, with the correct analysis of the problems, as well as the definition of appropriate policy, these are matters that can be overcome, and that the growth of our economies, the spread of prosperity in our areas is very, very, very feasible.
So just still on the back of that, though, Mr. President, if you can indulge me, how then should Africa moving forward then deal with its incoming partnerships with new partners from the East and the old traditional partners?
I think we deal as much as possible on recognizing what, first of all, are our own interests. I mean, we're saying that we want now to put the emphasis on value addition in our economic activities. It therefore means that if you are against selling cocoa in its raw form to the Western companies, the same thing applies in selling it to India or to China. So that our relationship with people outside our continent, based in the same way as others are with them. What is in our interest, medium, short-term, medium, and long-term? And then we fashion the policies that would allow us to realize our long-term, our medium, our short-term objectives within the context of the relationship that we have with people. But it is extremely important that we pay attention to what we can design for ourselves as responding to the problems that we have, problems of ignorance, of poverty on a wide scale. what are the policies that we need to put in place that would allow us to address those problems. Once that definition is made, that understanding is there, dealing across the table with others becomes that much easier. I think that to me is the approach that makes sense.
Mr. Pullman, you did talk about sustainable development, and companies do tend to push profitability, sometimes sidelining environmental and social objectives. So your sustainable business strategy, though, because in 2006, for instance, in 2016, Unilever's sustainable living brands grew by 50%. Why is it important for your company, though, to promote the wider development goals?
Well, what we should all realize is that we cannot have long-term businesses in an unsustainable world. We are starting to play now already with a lot of the world's planetary boundaries. In 2050, having more plastic in the oceans than fish is not a good thing, especially when 1 billion people make their livelihoods of the oceans, or the acidification of the oceans. We have 126 million refugees in the world. Many of them are climate change refugees, also in this continent. It's not a good thing. Goal number 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals is about food security. There are still 800 million people going to bed hungry, many in this part of the world, not even knowing if they wake up the next day. That's not good for business either. It generates discontent, it creates terrorism, it pulls these economies down, and it's very difficult then also to have a successful business there. We see the planetary boundaries playing out in this continent, unfortunately, more than anywhere else. Most of the cities, the big cities, are on the coasts. It's not a good thing when you have climate change. We have water shortages now in Cape Town. The next city, be it Nairobi or whatever, is knocking on the door, and so the thing goes. So we have to be sure that as we all grow together, that we can grow within the planetary boundaries and that we can grow for future generations. And that doesn't only mean the environmental side, it also means the social side. You have to have a more inclusive growth at the same time. Unfortunately, globally, we haven't figured that quite out. All the wealth creation last year only goes to about the top 1% of the world's population, who is getting richer and richer and richer, and that is just not a good thing. It's probably one of the reasons you see Brexit or the election results in the United States, and you don't want that to happen in other parts of the world. So for a business that wants to be around longer term, operating it in a more equitable and a sustainable way makes a lot of business sense. We put a commission together to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. And we found out that implementing the Sustainable Development Goals is an opportunity to unlock the global economy by about $12 trillion and create about 400 million jobs. Lots of them, as you would expect, in this part of the world. It is about the biggest agenda that we have. And on the question if Africa should depend on foreign aid or develop themselves, you don't have a choice, because foreign aid isn't there anymore. It's a pittance and the numbers are going down. Yet the opportunities, because we've waited so long, to invest in green energy, to invest in sustainable agriculture, to invest in education, the longer we have waited, the bigger the payouts are actually to do this. It is becoming very attractive. That's why I also believe that in terms of the new financial tools that are being created around blended financing, impact investing, all the things you know, that actually Africa increasingly is becoming an attractive continent to invest in. And that money has to come from the private sector because it simply isn't there in the public sector. You have too many governments here with too high levels of debt. Overseas development aid is going down at a rate of that we've never seen before. So we do have to unlock these economies by making them function, by putting the right fiscal policies in place, as the President says, putting the right governance in place, adding that with investments in infrastructure and education. And then this is an enormous opportunity that we have here. I look at it very positively in terms of opportunity. And the countries that make these decisions get a high payout. I mean, you look at Ghana growing, it's one of the fastest growing countries in the world for that reason. And there's no reason why that should stop as you continue to build on that momentum and put the right reforms in place.
But yes, Mr. President.
I was going to say that in order to support what he's saying is that it perhaps is one of the, perhaps the greatest challenge of our generation, how to inspire global consciousness to recognize that The mutuality involved in making sure that the sustainable development goals work is the mutuality that serves the interests of all aspects, all parts of humanity. Unfortunately, the paradigm that the global development has followed up to now is the we and us, we and them paradigm, which means what we can get basically is at the expense of other people. And the SDGs are making a very valiant attempt to try and change that paradigm, change our consciousness, change our attitude to recognizing that mutuality is a much safer, a much more enduring base for the future of humanity and for the growth of our planet. And to that extent, they are some of the most ambitious global goals that have ever been defined for us. And raising the consciousness of people, recognizing the value of going down this path of mutuality. That is a big challenge. Political leaders like myself, business leaders like him, civil society leaders, religious leaders, the whole gamut of people who are influencing public opinion in their respective countries and in regions. And I think it is an exercise that really calls for maximum support for people who can see a little bit further down the road as to what are the possibilities for us on this planet.
Mr. Pullman, of course, there are African entrepreneurs here with businesses that they want to grow, and they're going to be asking, can you still make profit, though, if you look at that long-term goal you're talking about, including the wider development, because your company is a $60 billion annual turnover, but if they're growing, can they be profitable in line with that?
Oh, I would actually argue you don't have to boil the ocean at once, or probably in Africa you say eat the elephant in one bite. You start to work it and expand your influence bit by bit. But for example, we have moved to green energy and we pay less than if you have fossil. We have moved all of our factories to zero waste, and we actually save money by doing that versus having waste that someone has to pay for. We think about what the consumer wants, and increasingly the consumer wants more sustainable products in the first place. We've moved all of our agricultural sourcing to sustainable sourcing and actually get a higher yield. It's a little bit of work sometimes, might have small investments in some other areas, but at the end of the day, the economic equation in many of these things starts to work for you. You can also look at it at the social side next to the environmental side. We find if you treat your people better in your value chain, then the people are probably also more loyal to you and have a higher productivity. So many of these things can be done today if we think about it. There's a very simple rule that I try to apply in this very confusing and fast-changing world. And that simple rule should start with a little bit the golden rule, actually, that is in every country and every religion, whatever it is, from Judaism to Hindu to Buddhism to Islam, which basically say, do unto others as you'd like to be done to yourselves. So do we want our children to work in child labor? I don't. Do we want our girls to be deprived from school and education? I wouldn't want that with my children. Do I want my children to live in an area where there is so much air pollution that you cut 10, 15 years of your life expectancy? I don't. So if we operate under the principles of how do we run our businesses in a way that we would like to be treated, it actually doesn't only result in a better, more robust business longer term, but it also actually results in a more efficient business longer term.
Right, Mr.
And it allows me to say, I don't know, I hope perhaps the concluding thing about what for me would be the defining achievement of my presidency in Ghana would be to make sure that every child in Ghana has access to good quality education. Recently, the educational system in Ghana has been failing our young people. I'll just give you one or two simple statistics. Between junior high school and senior high school, in the last 5 years, on an average, 100,000 young boys and girls who had had the qualifications to go from junior high school to senior high school were unable to take their place in senior high school, largely because their parents couldn't afford it. And you just sit back and look at a country like Ghana, 28, 29, 30 million people, and you have a period where within a decade, 1 million young boys and girls would come out into the into the labor force, into the workplace, with the skills and educational equipment of people at the age of 15, which is where junior high school ends. And you can imagine the world that is being created out there. And this is really the driving thing that brought my government to say that no, we're going to take on the burden. The public sector will take on the burden of providing for this generation senior high school to everybody. And in the first year of the operation of this policy, of making senior high school in Ghana, in our public schools, free, 90,000 more students entered senior high school in September this year, which was the first term of the policy, than had entered the year before. And it shows quite clearly that if we persist with this policy and get it, we're then going to make a really serious fist of making sure that everybody in Ghana has access to a decent education. Its implications for the country are enormous, especially at a time when all of us agree that mastering the digital technology that is now available can be the most important tool for development in this, what they call it, the fourth industrial revolution that it is. But that if we are able to give our young people the education, especially the right type of education, science and technology and mathematics, then we are preparing the Ghanaian future on the very, very solid basis. And that's what I want to be able to see for these 4 years that I have had the privilege of leading Ghana, that I can do, would be really for me the most important achievement of my period.
But I cannot let you go before I get your final comment regarding the CFTA, though, because it is going to be huge and enormous for the continent. And I want to hear your final message to the investors who are looking at Africa now, particularly with that 1.2 billion
we're trying
population
to,
now.
I think that all of these measures that are being elaborated and rolled out now, especially something like the Continental Free Trade Area, is that we are putting in place the building blocks for accelerating the development of our continent and of our economies. And we're saying that if we remain loyal and faithful to the analysis and to the prescriptions that we're beginning now to elaborate, what has happened in China, what has happened in Brazil, what has happened in India, where in China, within the space of 30 years, 600-700 people have been moved out of poverty into middle-class conditions. We can emulate that here in Africa and make sure that over the next generation, the specter of mass poverty that has bedeviled us on this continent, that we banish it and unleash the potential. And Africa on the march, and Africa where the extraordinary talents and potential, the young people of this continent. You can imagine the energies involved in these young people trying to cross the Sahara and drowning in the Mediterranean, or trying to cross the Mediterranean on these rickety boats. What would be the conclusion for us if those energies were turned inwards and help us building our continent? I'm very optimistic about the future of Africa, and I think that these are the ways that we can make sure that that optimism is well founded. I know it is said that the 21st century is going to be the Asian century. I disagree violently. I think the 21st century is going to be the African century, and I think that we can do it. Thank you.
Mr. President, I know you have to leave us shortly, but if we can get a final word from Mr. Polman, because How do you see this strategy of the CFTA? How do you see that affecting cross-border businesses for you?
In Africa specifically, I think the economic zones that the President has eloquently talked about already is a very good thing. So the quicker that can be rolled out further, ECOWAS here obviously is a very exciting project that is not much different from what a lot of things in Europe are happening and which have proven to work for the European continent, despite what some people are making you believe. So driving increasingly a African integration, and you have far more in common than you have differences. And unfortunately, we let a minority of people dwell on these differences, whilst we should spend all of our time celebrating these commonalities. So the more we can leverage the combined strengths of this continent, the better you're off. You have the biggest youth population that you have in the world. Actually, interestingly, there's the highest number of entrepreneurs that you have in this world. People that have enormous ambitions to create a better world for them and their future generations. You have the resources, actually, that are here to make it possible. So all the elements are here to make it a success. I don't think there's anything missing. And increasingly, Africa can do that by themselves. And fortunately, there's a whole group of responsible leaders, like the President and others, who have risen to positions of responsibility that are willing to exercise that right. So I always say no better time than now for Africa, and I fully agree with the President on that.
Right, Mr. Paul Polman and President Nana Akufo-Addo, I know you have to rush, but thank you very much for your insights when business meets politics. It's been fantastic. And thank you very much for listening in on these exciting sessions. We'll leave it there. It's a wrap. Thank you so much. Fantastic. I've been waiting. Thank you so much. Thank you.